I grew up in Mississippi. I told you that when we first met this morning, and I felt that these stories had great authenticity in the characters, in the way that they spoke to one another. And tell me, which one was your favorite?
Probably the second one. It's called Fetching Raymond. It's a story of these people. When you meet them, you're not sure where they're going, but they're going somewhere. Turns out they're going to death row at the state penitentiary in Parchman, which is a very infamous place in those parts, to visit the youngest brother who has been on death row for a long time. I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but there's a lot of humor initially in the story, and as it gets more complicated and you realize what is about to happen, it becomes very serious. It's hard to pick a favorite. I've never had so much fun writing as I had writing these stories, and they're all favorites.
With Fetching Raymond, for me, I really looked at that generational cycle of poverty and ignorance, and I would say that family absolutely exhibited that cycle that we see a lot.
You see a lot of it. Most of the stories are about people who are down on their luck, even the lawyers. 7 stories, I think 4 of them have lawyers as their principal characters. Those were people I knew when I was practicing law in a small town in Mississippi, even though they're fictional characters. I knew some of the things they did, the trouble they got in. I knew their clients, the judges, the courts, and all that. It's very authentic because it's very real. I mean, that's where I'm from, and that's where I lived. That's how I practiced law for 10 years.
Your opening story, Blood Drive. These guys are a bunch of knuckleheads, is the way that I describe them. And I think we all know a lot of people like that. Was that a fun one to write?
It was the first one I wrote. It goes back almost 20 years. And I was driving to Memphis from Oxford, Mississippi, one Friday afternoon, and a carload of rednecks came flying by me, big beefy boys, and a little tiny raggedy Honda Civic, no hubcaps, that kind of stuff. And they were already drinking beer, flying to get to Memphis for Friday night. And I just thought, what will happen to those knuckleheads tonight? What's going to happen? Well, it's all bad. It's all bad. And that was the inspiration for Blood Drive. And that was, I played with it for 20 years. And the more I wrote, the funnier it got. The more I wrote, the more trouble they got into. And once I got them to the strip club, I knew it was all over. So, based somewhat in reality.
That was a fun one to read.
We've all seen those guys going down the road.
Yeah. And those guys are universal.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I think anybody can read that story and appreciate that.
Yeah.
So another one of the stories in the book, Michael's Room. This is a really sad story.
One of the dangers of practicing law in a small town is that sometimes you come face to face with somebody you defeated in a lawsuit years earlier. And this is what this story's about. The lawyer who won the lawsuit, who defended a doctor accused of malpractice, because it was malpractice, comes face to face with the father of the little boy who should have been awarded some money. I never sued a doctor when I was a lawyer because in small towns, people really don't want you suing the doctors. And it's very difficult to beat a doctor in court in a small town and get a lot of money because no one has any money. They're not going to give it to you. All those elements go into the trial, to the story. But then the lawyer suddenly is forced to come face to face with the realities of what he did in a courtroom 6 years earlier. He's taken to see the little boy who was supposed to die, and he's not dead. And the family suffers greatly, struggling to care for him. And it's probably the most violent story, but also the most moving, I think. Maybe the last one, Funny Boys, probably it'll make you cry.
I love that story.
It'll make
It
you cry.
did. I have to say that was the very first John Grisham writing that really brought tears to my eyes.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
The last
make
passage
people
was
cry.
just it was beautifully written, and it's one of these stories that I found that in the beginning it was really about, it's a story about a young man that has AIDS and he comes home to die, and there's a lot of bigotry there's a lot of racism, but at the end there's also just this absolute goodness and beautiful human kindness from the woman that takes care of him.
Well, that's my favorite.
Yeah.
They're all my favorite, all 7.
Everybody has a favorite Grisham book. For me, it was always Time to Kill, but I have to say that Ford County may have supplanted that. I loved it. I want to thank you so much for being here with us today at Borders. It was a real pleasure to meet you.
Well,
and
I'm so glad. You're the first person who said that Ford County is their favorite book. It was published 3 hours ago, so I'm glad to finally hear that.
I loved it, and I know your fans will.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much
for being here.
My pleasure.